the Goods fam on Twitch. This is Philly Good, and we're going to be taking a look at the MPCX again today. I'm here every day 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and yeah, we're just going through the MPC Bible, learning about the MPCX. So if you have an MPC, you can get it started up and follow along. If you have the MPC Bible, right now we are on chapter 17, building velocity sensitive drum kits, so you can follow along from there. If you want to see any of the previous chapters, they're in my YouTube and also here on Twitch, the previous videos, so you should be able to catch up if you want to do that. And we're gonna kick off where we were yesterday, setting up the velocity switch ranges. If you can, please follow, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and that'll let you know when we're here next. Alright, so now to stop our kick and snare pads simply playing all three layers simultaneously, we need to set up dynamic switching. Dynamic switching works by the MPC detecting how hard you hit the pad, for example the velocity. Based on your parameters to play, you need to set up the velocity ranges to do this. So go to samples 3 screen for pad A05. Okay. Oh yeah, this isn't what we had loaded up previously. Let's see if I can find what we had. We might have been on a different maybe a different drum program too. It would be good to know where I was last, right? What did we have loaded up last? Let me just take a quick look back. Let's go to the chapter 17 folder and see if we can find what we were using. Okay, I'm gonna load the one called fingerkit.xpj. I believe that's what we were working on last. And yes, it does appear to be this. Yeah, with the soft, the medium, and the hard hits all layered on top of each other. So let's go back to where we were there. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to go to the samples 3 page for pad A05. The velocity ranges are set in the vel start and vel end columns, Q-link columns 2 and 3 respectively. With vel start handling the lowest velocity value and vel end the highest velocity value for this layer. The idea here is to set a suitable range for each layer that doesn't overlap the range set for any other layer. So first we need to define the range for a hard hit. For example, we could say a hard hit covers a velocity of 110 to 127. Remember, the hardest hit on an MPC is represented by a velocity of 127. A medium hit could cover a velocity range of 60 to 109, and a soft hit would therefore cover everything below this. For example, a velocity range of 0 to 59. These are just suggestions. There's no actual hard rule, and you can set velocity ranges to any values you wish based on your unique playing style. You'll also find your preferred velocity ranges will vary for each kit you build. So now we simply need to enter these ranges onto the layers on pads A05 and A06. First, as we are them both so our edits can be applied to both pads simultaneously, saving time. To do this, hold down the Shift key and press pad A5 and A6 . Now both pads are illuminated and you'll see both pads displayed in the top bar. Right here. That's really cool. I didn't know you could do that. So launch edit zones, multiple pads selected. Oh, I don't see that. Okay, now any changes you make to one of these pads will be mirrored in the other pad. So press close. I guess I don't have to press close. You can now set your velocity switch ranges. I find it tricky to enter exact values with the Q links in this screen, so I prefer to single tap each value and use the data wheel. Set up your values as follows. So we're going to have 110, 127, 60, 109, 0, 59, and 0, and 127. So mine was already set up just the way we wanted it. Leave multiple mode by pressing the edit zones icon, selecting current. Press A05 and then A06 and observe in the samples 3 screen how both pads have identical velocity ranges set up. So I guess I close this. Oh, I gotta turn on the volume. Okay, anyway. Performing velocity switches. With your velocity switches configured, it's time to try them out. The most important step here is to turn full level off. Mine's already off. Otherwise, all your pad hits will be at a velocity of 127 regardless of the actual velocity you actually strike the pad with. So make sure the full level button is not illuminated on your hardware, nor should it be flashing. Half level, which is set by holding down Shift when pressing full level. So you don't want it to be like that or like that. It should be like that. So with full level off, start hitting pad A05 at different levels of hardness from soft all the way up to hard. You should hear the different dynamic sample layers being played. At this point, you may need to tweak the velocity ranges to suit your style of playing. For example, if you tend to hit the pads fairly softly, then your soft range may need to be set lower. Another thing to consider is the level of each layer. It's important that your switching is smooth, and often if your sounds have been individually normalized, a soft snare can actually sound far too loud compared to one of the harder hits. To adjust any layers that appear too loud, simply change the level setting for that specific layer, and yeah, for example, in the MPC Bible, they adjusted their soft to 83 level. That's the third column in the samples 2 screen. Now for me, this gave a much smoother transition between layers. Layer switching, creating cycle kits. In addition to the velocity switching option, we're also able to utilize the different layers on our pads by having the MPC play a different layer each time the pad is hit, regardless of the actual velocity you hit the pad. This method is perfect when you have a bunch of multi-samples that were originally played at a similar velocity but with different timbres. This option is independent of velocity, so even works with full level and half level switched on. We looked at cycle and random earlier in the book, and we did that when we set up a round robin for our layered vinyl crackle. This time, let's set up the closed hi-hat on pad A07. All the closed hi-hats we have are medium velocity hats, but each one sounds slightly different. Assign RSCH1 to layer 1, RSCH2 to layer 2, and RSCH3 to layer 3 the way I have it here. As before, these layers are currently set to all play simultaneously when the pad is struck. To change this behavior, go to Program, Edit, Global, and adjust the layer play setting to either cycle or random. Either of these settings will work fine. You could argue that cycle will always ensure that each pad hit will produce a different sample every time, while with random there's a possibility that you could get the same sample play a few times in succession. But it's up to you. Set layer to either random or cycle. Now, hit pad A07 several times in succession to hear your cycling or random layer play in action. Sounds pretty good. Remember, if you had 4 samples, you could use all 4 assigned to the 4 layers. And if you have 2, you could just use those 2. It doesn't matter if some layers are blank, the MPC will just ignore them. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water here. Alright, so if you're just joining us, please jump in the chat. I'm trying to get 5 people in the chat. That's my goal again today. So let's let's try and get that done sometime. That'd be awesome. Adding sample tail. All these drums are just a little smooth fade at the end of these drums. We met the tail length parameter in the last chapter. Tail length is a per layer parameter, so it's a little tricky to add it to the pads with multiple layers, as it's hard to trigger and review a specific layer to hear how the tail setting is working out on that specific layer. Except on velocity switch layers, where you can at least use full level or shift and full level for the half level option. But if you really need to isolate a layer, you could temporarily set the level for the other layers on that pad to 0. I found the drums in this kit on the whole could only handle about 50 to 75 milliseconds of tail before it started getting artifacts, but it's definitely worth adding even a small amount to help provide a little fade out to the ends of the drums. Excuse me. Muting the open hat with mute targets. We previously looked at muting an open hi-hat via mute groups. Drum programs offer us a slightly more refined muting option in the form of mute targets. The advantage of mute targets is that they allow us to set up a one-way mute. So select pad A07 and then go to the global screen, look at the final column, and here we can set up to 4 mute targets for our closed hat. Any pad number we enter here will be muted by our A07 closed hat. So set the top mute target to A08. That's it. Hit A08 quickly, followed by A07, and the one-way mute works perfectly. Sounds good. If you want A07 to mute other sounds, you can add up to 3 further mute targets. However, that's the maximum. So in this respect, mute groups win hands down, as in theory you could assign an entire program to the same mute group, so all 128 sounds could mute each other. Mono versus poly pads. The default polyphony for an MPC drum program is poly. You see it down there, which means each pad in your program can play over as many other pads as you wish. So in theory, you could have, for example, pads A01, A02, A03, and A04 all playing at the same time, no problem. If your entire program is set to mono playback, then only one pad can ever play in that program at any given moment. The instant you hit another pad, the first pad will be immediately silenced. Only the last hit pad will ever be heard. This is referred to as a monophonic program, and is often used with synth-based instruments and chopped sample programs. However, there is another poly setting, but this is for each individual pad. This is referred to as pad polyphony. When an individual pad is set to poly mono, the default setting, this pad will act monophonically only with itself. So, for example, if you repeatedly hit the open hat on A08, each pad hit will replace the previous open hat hit. If a pad is set to poly, it can overlap itself as much as you want it to. Okay. The pad poly setting is not affected by any other pads, so an open hat set to poly mono within a poly program can play simultaneously with other pads, but can only ever have one instance of the open hat playing at any one moment in time. So I find that a mono pad polyphony can often sound a little unnatural, especially on crashes, snares, and open hats. So why would you use mono? Well, Other than perhaps preferring the way it sounds, one reason is to preserve global polyphony, as there is a maximum number of voices that can play at any given time in the MPC. 64 stereo voices. More than this, and the MPC will start silencing notes to compensate. By limiting how many times a pad can overlap itself, you can reduce the overall polyphony used. An alternative to poly-poly is to set a specific maximum number of voices that a pad can ever consume. So a pad poly of 2 will only allow that pad to ever play 2 instances of itself at any one time. Hit a third instance, and the first instance is instantly silenced. To quickly set all pads in your program to a different pad polyphony, just use the Edit Zones All function. Velocity sensitive timbre emulations. It's not always possible to obtain multiple timbre variations of our drum sounds, but the MPC offers a number of ways to emulate these variations on the fly. Select pad A10. You can manipulate a specified program parameter based on how hard you hit the pad. To show exactly how this works, firstly turn Obviously, you'll be able to hear the difference in volume, but that's the only change you're going to hear. Amp attack. Remember how I explained how softer hits have more attack taken off them? Well, the amp attack value is able to remove increasing amounts of attack from your sample the softer you hit it. If you hit the pad at full velocity, it takes no attack off the snare, giving you the full crack as you'd expect. Hit it with a medium velocity and it will take off a medium amount of attack. Tap the amp attack parameter and start turning the data wheel clockwise. The value you're setting now will determine the maximum amount of attack that will be taken off your snare. This is the attack setting that gets applied at the softest possible velocity you can strike a pad with. For example, a velocity of 1. Now repeat the soft to hard pad preview we performed earlier. This time, not only is the volume of the snare varying with the velocity as you'd expect, but the attack at the beginning of the snare is clearly changing depending on how soft or hard your hit is. The softer hits clearly have a lot less attack left on them, while the hard hits are nice and punchy. If you're here and watching, please jump in the chat. I'm trying to get 5 people in the chat today. Please, please, please. Velocity over pitch. We can do the same with the tuning of our sample using the velocity pitch setting. Set this to something pretty high, such as 80, and once again play pad A10 at varying velocities. So where do we have that? Velocity pitch setting, set it to 80. Oh, weird. You should hear the softer notes have little or no tuning changes, while your harder hits have a very high-pitched tuning. Obviously, this is an extreme example and we need to be more subtle, So reduce the pitch setting to 6. I thought that was pretty cool. Alright, now you can hear that as you vary the velocity, there are very subtle changes to the tuning of the sample. Velocity over pan. Okay, so this one of the this one is less about realistic timbre emulation and more about creating an interesting effect. With pan set to 127, that's all the way, isn't it? Yeah. You can hear it in its full extreme glory. Simply strike A10 multiple times, starting soft and gradually increasing to full velocity, and you'll hear the snare move from the left to the right of the stereo field. Yeah, I can definitely hear that going from speaker to speaker in here. You may not hear it because you're on just a single mic, so I don't know how that works out for you. But yeah, I can definitely hear it in the room here coming from both sides. Assign the RS-CH1 to pad A03. We're going to go back here. Oh, we're on pad all, so we're going to go here. We're going to go mode current, and pad A3. We were set to all there from earlier. So now that we're set to the single pad A3, it's a hi-hat, and we'll configure the tail length to 64 milliseconds. So let's see, where do we do this? This is in the samples 4 screen. The RS-CH1 hi-hat to pad 03. So I had a different one here. We're going to change it to the RS-CH1, and let's see, where do we set the tail length? We're supposed to set the tail length to 64 milliseconds. Okay, that's it right there, the tail length. So 64 milliseconds. I guess if you press shift, you can go down by smaller increments and turn the data wheel, and down to 64 milliseconds now. Now we're gonna head over the sample 4 screen where we were just at, and this is the randomization screen where the MPC offers a number of ways to introduce random variations to the samples on your pads. I've played with this a few times, not knowing what I was doing, but it always created very cool effects. So let's look at using some of these parameters to add some natural sounding variation to a drum sound. The first 4 columns contain randomized parameters that can be applied to specific layers on your pad. The 5th up here, it says all layers. So the final control is the depth. Oh, this is the depth right here, this fader looking thing. So this allows you to reduce the overall strength of randomization applied across the pad. Oh wow, very cool. So set full level on. Make sure pad A03 is selected. Now set the pitch control for layer 1 to 100. So it's cranked all the way. Begin hitting pad A03 repeatedly, and should hear the pitch of the hi-hat varies each time by quite a large amount. can hear it better when I have it hitting super fast. So we're going to set this to a more subtle amount of 22. I guess that's a cool way too to figure out what something does, is just crank it all the way up and hear what happens to the sound, and then once you know what it actually does, then you can turn it down, because a lot of times if you don't know what you're doing, just playing around, you might do something cool and not know how to recreate it. So it's always fun to just twist the dials all the way around and hear what it actually is doing to the sounds. So we're going to begin hitting pad A03 repeatedly. Actually, we're just going to set it to 20 and preview it several times. So this one really works well. Oh, actually, no, they wanted it on 22. Sorry. So the offset parameter randomizes the amount of offset on your layer. So that's over here. Basically starting your sample from random start points. Oh, try an offset of 20 and preview several times. Okay. So that one works really well. It sounds very natural. Now set a level of 15. It's already at 15 on mine. Remember, we already set full level on. So this level randomization is going to randomly reduce the output volume of your pad regardless. Now on the whole pad randomization, the attack is going to be similar to the velocity sensitive attack parameter we looked at previously, except this one isn't dependent on velocity. It's completely random instead. Try an attack of 33. Mine's already set there. Decay will randomize the decay. This one is a bit more tricky to get working well, as decay only really reduces heavily when a drum is hit really softly. Oddly, there is no velocity decay option in the modulation screen. I set this one to 67, but it's very subtle. The depth parameter allows you to reduce the amount of randomization across the whole pad. For example, set it to 0 and you'll no longer hear any randomization. So use this if you like the ratio or mix of different randomization parameters that you've configured, but feel that perhaps they should be less obvious. So leave this at 100. Alright. Pad A03 sounds pretty good. You could also combine it with the velocity sensitive parameters from the modulation screen to really bring some dynamic randomization. Try adding randomization to the other pads in the kit. You can even add it to the cycled pads as well. Okay. Do we want to add it to the other pads? Oh, I see. Some of them are too, they have much less stuff going on with them. Just messing around, seeing what happens. Cool. So, utilizing the LFO. One very interesting timbre emulation parameter can be utilized through the low frequency oscillator, LFO. The LFO will modulate certain parameters on your pad based on a particular waveform shape. But if you choose the noise waveform, this is going to act in a random fashion. First, select pad A02 and assign the hard snare RS SN H1 sample to layer 1, and then go to LFO. Now on the LFO row, set wave parameter to noise. This setting generates random modulation and can actually create pretty realistic timbre variations. Currently it is having no effect, but tap the pitch setting and change this to 70. Keep hitting pad A02 continuously to hear the result. You'd hear that the random LFO is quite obviously affecting the timbre of the snare, and in my opinion this sounds fairly natural. I reckon a setting of 6 is probably the best here, so crank that back down. It's not too obvious, but it still generates some interestingly different but subtle timbres. You could also set the amp to 7, and that'll introduce some randomly modulated volume. We'll be using the LFO in more depth later on, so I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. If you're here and watching, please jump in the chat. I'd really appreciate it. Trying to get 5 people in the chat today. If I get 5 people in the chat, I'll do a little happy dance. Alright, extending the open hat. Currently our chopped open hat is fairly short, so it'd be nice if we could lengthen it, especially if we are playing a slow tempo beat where open hats can often stay open for longer periods. We discovered looping in chapter 14, where we looked at standard forward looping to create sustained loops. A sustained loop can make sense when dealing with open hats, as it gives us the option of leaving the hi-hat open for as long as we require. A quicker way of sustained looping, which works well with percussive sounds, is alternating looping, or alt loop for short. With an alternating loop, when the audio reaches the end point, it doesn't jump instantly to the loop start point. Instead, it travels in reverse back to the loop point. Upon reaching the loop start point, it travels forwards again towards the end point. This all playback means that there's never a harsh, sudden jump from endpoint to loop start point. Therefore, you tend to get smoother transitions at the loop points. The downside is that half the loop is played in reverse, which can sound odd with musical notes, but is often not noticeable with percussion sounds. first, just quickly head over to Sample Edit and set the RS-OH1 sample to loop on forward. Loop on forward. Okay, it's already set there. And basically, we just need the MPC to see this open hat as a loop sample. Now go to Program Edit, Global, and hit pad A08. And set the sample play to note on. Whoop, right there, note on. Alright, now go back to Program Edit, Samples, and in the top right of the screen, tap on the gear icon and set Loop Lock to off and Zero Snap to on. And close that. Now, you're free to change the loop point of this layer independently from the start point. Set pad loop Alt. Let's see. Pad loop Alt. So it's got the arrows pointing backwards and forwards to indicate that it's going to do that alternating forward to backward type motion through the sound. This button will be disabled unless you first set the sample as a loop in Sample Edit. So Sample Edit, you got to set it to loop. Okay. Oh wait, that's not the right one though. It's the, let's turn that one back off. It was the sample RS-OH1. There it is. And yes, it does have the loop on. Go back to Program Edit, and the pad loop is on the Alt setting. Okay. Now tap the loop point and move it to an area where the open hat's waveform is becoming more consistent at around 10,000. Okay. I don't know how you can tell if it's at 10,000 or not, but just judging by the top bar there. All right. Now tap the end point and move this back to a position before the hat starts decaying at around 14,000. Closest I can get it. And press and hold pad A08 to hear the alternating loop in action. Okay. Anyway, the problem you might find is that when finger drumming, you might not feel comfortable having to hold down a drum pad, as you'll probably used to be you're used to triggering them just one shot style. So if you forget that the open hat is set to note on, you'll end up with a very short open hat. Luckily, there's a pretty good workaround for this. Head over to envelopes and set a fairly long release of 100. Just tap the pad and you hear carry on playing. Thanks to the combination of release and looping, and thanks to the mute target we set for the hat on A07, we can shut off our hi-hat whenever we please by hitting A07. Obviously, this open hat might sound odd if you leave it playing for too long, but in your average drum kit performance, it will work very nicely indeed. In fact, if you listen to a real open hat, they often sizzle during decay, and the alternate loop also emulates this a little. Open hat muting with note off. This little trick is pretty cool as an alternative to the mute target open hat method. First, copy the closed hat pad A03 to pad A12. Remember, to do this, hold down the copy hardware button and tap on pad A03 and then tap on pad A12 and then release copy. Now go to the program edit global and look at the sample play options. We're already comfortable with one shot and note on, but there's a third option which is note off. So press and hold pad A12, nothing happens. Oh wait. Okay. If you press and hold it, nothing happens. When you release the pad, your closed hat will play. Okay. Unusual, but this doesn't seem massively useful, but bear with me. Copy the open hat pad A08 completely out of the way in a different pad bank. In fact, let's mirror it in bank B. So copy A08 to pad B8 using the copy button. Go to pad B8. So how do I... Okay, you just switch to the different bank using the top pad bank buttons. And then you let go, and it should have done that for you. Let me see if I go to sample assign and take a look in the B bank. And then I take a look at the A bank. RSSNH1, RSSNH1, yeah, it has the same copied over. So go to pad B8 and in the envelope screen so in the envelope screen, reduce the release to 63. We don't want this open hat to have that really long release, just a mild fade out. Now return to bank A and select pad A12, and again go to the program, edit, global. Seen how the MPC can play multiple sample layers together, but we can also play multiple pads together using the simultaneous play function. Simply set the top simultaneous play option to pad B08. Now hold down pad A08 as it now simultaneously triggers pad B08. You'll initially only hear that open hat on B08 as A12's note off setting means the closed hat is initially silent. But when you release A12, the note off setting will be triggered and will play the closed hat. Sounds really good, as it means you can control the open closed hat combo with just a single pad, A12. Load up the project file fingerkit.xpj. That's what we've got loaded up right now, actually. From the Chapter 17 folder, and select Sequence 1. On track 1, they assign their final version of the kit, fingerkit.xpm. Here they tweak the kit, and they tweaked it here and there to help improve its performance for finger drumming. Basically, every technique they've covered in this chapter is there in some form or another, but they've added a crash sample to pad A04. This wasn't chopped from a break. Instead, they searched through their drum collection to find a crash that suited the vibe of the kit they built. Using Humanize on drum performances. Sequence 1, Break, features a sequence they wrote during the using the finger drumming kit. All events are recorded to track 1. Take a look at it in the grid. Most of the sequence was mostly recorded with the 1/16 quantize and full level on, except for some ghost notes which they overdubbed on a second pass with full level off. Let's use Humanize to give this track a slightly more organic, loose vibe. With track 1 selected in main, hit the pencil icon on the track row and select Humanize. First, they want to add a general humanization of all event velocities. Nothing outrageous, just a subtle variation to temper all the full level action. So uncheck Humanize time and keep Humanize note length unchecked. This isn't relevant in a sequence filled with one-shots. Check Humanize velocity and set strength to 14%. Keep the input filter unchecked. Okay, and hit apply. Just apply our velocity humanization in the background. Hit play start. If you think you should have added more velocity humanization, and then undo, and now set a higher strength value and hit apply again. Now hit pad A06 to select all the main closed hat events. Remember, this requires that the previous configured it requires that you previously configured the hitting a pad selects all events option in the grid view settings. With the main closed hat events selected, we can add some extra humanization to the hats. Check the humanized time box and try an amount of 25 and an eagerness of 4. Set the humanized velocity strength to 20 and finally check the only apply to selected events box. Hit apply and play start. Again, if you wish to experiment with the settings, hit undo and try again until you're happy. I find the hats and other percussion, such as shakers, are often the best candidates for timing humanization. If you're going to add humanization timing to kicks and snares, it's normally best to use small amounts, otherwise it can really mess with the groove. Check out the humanized version on sequence 2. And that'll end it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Please jump in the chat if you're here, and I'd like to get 5 people in the chat. That's my goal for today. If you do, before I close out, I will do a little happy dance for you, but I don't believe we have the amount of viewers we need, so probably not happen today, but maybe I'll bring that back next time. All right, so I'm just gonna close it with a little beat I made last Sunday. Please follow, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to let you know that I'm here every day from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the Goods Fam on Twitch. This is Philly Good on the MPC, showing you how to use the MPC. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Peace out, y'all. Have a good one. You guys are ready to check out, let's see, we'll raid into Nickelodeon's